It was not until the following morning, during that peculiar interval between breakfast and the arrival of the post, that Peter experienced the sort of mild illumination which, in his experience, invariably preceded a more substantial and considerably less comfortable revelation. He had taken himself for a constitutional walk through the gardens of Rosebloom Gate, ostensibly to clear his head of the accumulated trivialities that cluttered any initial investigation, but in reality to observe the mechanics of the household at its daily work. The head gardener, an elderly man named Pettigrew, with the weathered countenance of one who had spent 40 years coaxing vegetables and flowers from reluctant soil, had proven remarkably forthcoming when approached with the sort of casual courtesy that seemed to dissolve most professional reticence. It was Pettigrew who had maintained the azalea in the Colonel's study, had he confirmed, nodding with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had been properly acknowledged. A particularly temperamental specimen, requiring precise watering schedules and positioning relative to available light. The Colonel, Pettigrew explained, with the tone of a man describing a beloved but complicated relative, had insisted upon these specific arrangements for the past 3 months, ever since the previous gardener, young Hartley, had departed under circumstances which Pettigrew described as not entirely straightforward, if you take my meaning, sir. Peter most certainly did take his meaning, and he filed this observation away with the careful precision of a man accustomed to discovering that the most significant details invariably announced themselves as peripheral remarks made by reliable witnesses attempting to be helpful. He had inquired, with studied indifference, regarding the exact nature of these not entirely straightforward circumstances, and Pettigrew, after the sort of hesitation that suggests internal moral calculation, had admitted that young Hartley had been discovered in some compromising situation with the Colonel's wife, or rather the Colonel's widow, as she had technically become some 18 months prior to Hartley's employment. The matter had been handled quietly, naturally, but the Colonel had been considerably exercised by the incident, and had subsequently taken a more detailed interest in the horticultural arrangements, personally selecting which plants graced his study and when. This revelation, whilst interesting in its own right, might have remained precisely what it appeared to be, a piece of domestic scandal of the sort that decorated English country houses like fungi on a neglected log, had Peter not happened to encounter Mrs. Merryweather herself during his perambulations through the morning room some hours later. She was a woman of perhaps 45, handsome in that particular fashion, which suggests a life spent in studious attention to matters of appearance and the cultivation of a certain studied melancholy that widows, particularly wealthy widows with secret histories, invariably employed as both shield and advertisement. She had greeted him with the sort of warm hospitality reserved for investigating gentlemen of title, and had seated herself upon a rather uncomfortable settee whilst making the sort of conversational overtures that indicated a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations through the application of charm and strategic vulnerability. Her marriage to the Colonel, she had explained, had been one of those peculiar arrangements that English society tolerated with resigned disapproval, a union contracted for reasons of property and mutual advantage, rather than any overwhelming affection. The Colonel, she had intimated, had been a man of rigid temperament, inclined toward jealousy and the sort of controlling behavior that masqueraded as concern for propriety. His death, whilst she had naturally experienced the customary emotional disruption, had not entirely surprised her given his advanced years and his tendency toward excessive indulgence in port and rich foods. She had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the Colonel had seemed particularly agitated during the past weeks, had been receiving mysterious correspondence, and had taken to locking his study door at irregular intervals. She had assumed, naturally, that his nephew's financial circumstances had finally forced some sort of reckoning, perhaps a review of the will or the institution of certain restrictions upon future inheritances. Peter had listened to this recitation with the sort of courteous attention that encouraged elaboration, whilst committing every detail to that portion of his mind which operated independently of social convention and the polite requirements of conversation. He had observed, quite incidentally, that Mrs. Merryweather's hands trembled only slightly when discussing the Colonel's death, that her eyes maintained a consistent focus upon the middle distance rather than upon her conversational partner, and that she had made no inquiry whatsoever regarding the investigation's progress or the likelihood of swift resolution. These observations, individually insignificant, collectively suggested the presence of someone operating under considerable internal strain, a woman maintaining composure through the application of considerable psychological effort. When he had departed the morning room and returned to the study under the pretext of reviewing the scene once more, Peter had found himself contemplating not the manner of the Colonel's death, but rather the precise arrangement of his desk, the positioning of the chairs before it, and the peculiar fact that the study door possessed an excellent view, through its frosted glass panes, of anyone approaching from the corridor. The valet had mentioned that the Colonel invariably kept his study locked during the evening hours. That access had been restricted to the Colonel himself and, upon occasion, his nephew when business required it. Yet the valet had also noted, somewhat elliptically, that on the evening in question, Wednesday, he had noticed the door standing slightly ajar at approximately 7 o'clock, though when he had mentioned this to the Colonel, the older man had become rather sharply irritable and had dismissed him with more force than the situation seemed to warrant. By the time the noon post arrived, bringing with it a telegram from an old acquaintance in Hampshire, and a letter bearing the rather cryptic notation of a firm of solicitors, Peter had begun to construct a hypothesis which, whilst still possessing considerable gaps and the sort of uncertainties that plagued all preliminary theorization, suggested an entirely different arrangement of motive and opportunity than that which Inspector Graves continued to pursue with such confident determination. The solicitor's letter, when opened, proved to contain information regarding the Colonel's will, recently altered and witnessed only 3 weeks prior, which modified the disposition of his estate in rather significant and, one might have said, catastrophically disadvantageous ways for his nephew. It was this letter, combined with the accumulated observations regarding azaleas, locked doors, compromised widows, and the mysterious departure of a young gardener named Hartley, that suggested to Peter the presence of a conspiracy considerably more intricate than the simple murder of an inconvenient uncle by an impatient heir. The true architecture of the crime, he suspected, required considerably more careful excavation, and the comfortable surface explanation that Graves was preparing to present to his superiors was almost certainly a construction designed to obscure rather than illuminate the genuine chain of events that had culminated in the Colonel's death. Peter's examination of the solicitor's documentation revealed itself to be considerably more illuminating than one might have anticipated from mere legal prose, and the customary circumlocutions that practitioners of that profession invariably employed when discussing matters of testamentary disposition. The Colonel's previous will, executed some 15 years prior, had established Richard as his primary beneficiary, with the bulk of the estate, valued at approximately £70,000, a sum not inconsiderable even in contemporary circumstances, devolving upon his nephew's shoulders. However, the revised document, witnessed by 2 respectable parties and bearing all the formal apparatus of legal authentication, had fundamentally altered this arrangement. The estate was now to be divided equally between Richard and Mrs. Merriweather, with certain specific provisions regarding the maintenance of the house and grounds, and rather curious stipulations regarding the disposition of the Colonel's personal papers and correspondence. More intriguingly still, there existed a codicil, appended to the document with evident haste and dated only 4 days prior to the Colonel's death, which reserved to the testator the right to make further alterations should circumstances warrant, a clause that suggested the Colonel had possessed some anticipatory anxiety regarding the stability of his final arrangements. The solicitor's covering letter made oblique reference to the Colonel's visit to the office, during which he had appeared, according to the attending clerk, to be under considerable emotional distress, and had made several rather cryptic remarks regarding the protection of family reputation and the prevention of further scandal. These observations, taken in conjunction with the information regarding young Hartley's hasty departure, began to suggest a narrative considerably more complex than simple avarice or domestic conflict. Peter had placed a telephone call to an old acquaintance in the constabulary, not Inspector Graves, whose pride was already considerably invested in the apprehension of Richard Merriweather, but rather a superintendent of more philosophical disposition who occupied himself with matters of organized crime and the subtler varieties of human deception. What emerged from this conversation was intelligence regarding young Hartley, who, it transpired, had not simply been discovered in some compromising situation with the widow, but had, in fact, been previously known to Scotland Yard in connection with a rather sophisticated scheme involving the blackmail of country gentlemen through the manufacture of compromising photographs. Hartley had operated, it appeared, in concert with an accomplice, a woman of considerable cunning who invariably secured employment in households of moderate to substantial wealth, and who had been responsible for the actual photographic documentation whilst Hartley provided the physical element of the scenario. The scheme had not, the superintendent regretted to inform Peter, resulted in prosecutions, as the victims had invariably preferred discretion to the public exposure that would necessarily accompany criminal proceedings. The Merriweather case had been no exception. The colonel had paid rather substantially for the privilege of silence, had subsequently dismissed both conspirators from his service, and had their heir. After behaved, according to available reports, like a man whose conception of his own standing in the county had been rather forcefully undermined by the discovery of his wife's indiscretions. This intelligence, whilst not entirely surprising given what Peter had already begun to suspect, nevertheless clarified certain aspects of the colonel's behavior during his final weeks. The mysterious correspondence, the locked study, the irritability and evident preoccupation, all now suggested themselves as symptoms of a man engaged in some form of final reckoning, some attempt to secure his affairs against the contingency of betrayal or exposure. Peter had therefore taken the liberty of making inquiries regarding Mrs. Merriweather's movements during the 6 months preceding the colonel's death, and had discovered that she had, quite remarkably, taken on a new lady's maid approximately 4 months prior, a woman of perhaps 35, recently arrived from London, with impeccable references and a manner that suggested neither excessive familiarity nor inappropriate reserve. The woman's name was reported as Miss Crane, though Peter suspected that this was almost certainly an assumed appellation, and her present whereabouts had become, subsequent to the colonel's death, rather spectacularly obscure. Mrs. Merriweather, when delicately questioned regarding Miss Crane's sudden departure, had professed considerable surprise at the woman's absence, and had suggested that perhaps the shock of the colonel's death had unsettled her, leading to an impromptu resignation executed without proper notice. This explanation was sufficiently plausible that it might have satisfied a less attentive investigator. But Peter had noted the slight rigidity that accompanied this statement, the manner in which Mrs. Merriweather's fingers had gripped the armrest of her chair, and the fact that her pupils dilated precisely the sort of infinitesimal degree that accompanied the production of deliberate falsehood. By the time Peter had concluded his preliminary investigations and returned to the village of Ashford-in-Vale for an extended consultation with the local publican, a man of remarkable insight regarding the intimate affairs of the neighborhood, he had begun to perceive the dim outlines of a conspiracy that extended considerably beyond the simple removal of an inconvenient uncle. The publican, a garrulous individual of some 60 years' experience in the observation of human nature, had provided the final crucial piece of information. Richard Merriweather had been observed, on the afternoon preceding the colonel's death, in animated conversation with a woman of striking appearance at the Red Lion, a woman who had subsequently departed in a motorcar bearing London registration plates and had not been seen in the vicinity since. The publican was quite certain, he had insisted, that this woman had been familiar to him, though he could not precisely recall the context of their acquaintance, save that it possessed some faintly disreputable character. Peter, having been provided with a reasonably accurate description, had experienced the rather distinct sensation of a hypothesis beginning to achieve coherence, a sense that the scattered fragments of information were assembling themselves into a configuration that, whilst still possessing certain obscurities, now manifested a logical structure and an internal consistency that the initial investigation had entirely lacked. The colonel's death had not, Peter was beginning to suspect, been the simple consequence of Richard's financial desperation or Mrs. Merriweather's widowed vulnerability, but rather the culmination of a carefully orchestrated scheme that had been set in motion months previously, engineered by Conspirato. RS of considerable sophistication, and executed with a precision that suggested both malice aforethought and an intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, his household, and his psychological vulnerabilities. It was precisely at this juncture in Peter's reasoning that Inspector Graves arrived at Rosebloom Gate with an expression of barely concealed triumph and a warrant for Richard Merriweather's immediate arrest, having at last secured the necessary authorizations from his superiors and the Crown Prosecutor's Office. The nephew, when confronted with the evidence of his financial embarrassment and the incontrovertible fact of his inheritance, had adopted that particular combination of indignation and defensive transparency that characterized men accustomed to minor transgressions, but unaccustomed to accusations of capital crime. He had admitted, with the sort of sullen candor that suggested capitulation to the inevitable, that yes, his affairs were in considerable disarray, that yes, he had anticipated his uncle's eventual demise with something approaching fervent hope, and that yes, he had been somewhat less than forthcoming regarding his movements on the evening in question. However, he had protested with considerable vehemence. He had not poisoned his uncle, had not administered strychnine in any form whatsoever, and had certainly not harbored any intention of committing murder, whatever his financial circumstances might suggest to the contrary. He had, it transpired, been dining with his mistress in Maida Vale, a circumstance which he had been reluctant to disclose for reasons of propriety and the potential distress to his family, and whilst he was prepared to acknowledge his moral shortcomings and his financial improprieties, he was not prepared to confess to a murder he had not committed. Graves, somewhat disconcerted by this lack of the customary gratitude hat murderers invariably displayed upon being arrested, had nevertheless proceeded with the formalities of incarceration, maintaining with professional stubbornness that the evidence, whilst circumstantial, was sufficiently compelling to warrant prosecution. Peter had observed this entire proceeding with the expression of a man watching a performance that, whilst adequately executed, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the drama being presented. It was therefore with a certain degree of theatrical courtesy that Peter had requested a private audience with Inspector Graves, during which he had delicately suggested that the arrest of Richard Merriweather, whilst potentially satisfying to those inclined toward swift resolution, might represent a somewhat premature conclusion to an investigation that possessed considerably greater complexity than initial appearances suggested. Graves, whose professional pride had already become somewhat invested in the certainty of his case, had responded to these suggestions with the sort of defensive irritation that characterized men who suspected they had been made to appear foolish without being entirely certain of the grounds for such suspicion. However, Peter had persisted with the sort of urbane insistence that seemed to render resistance increasingly futile, and had eventually prevailed upon Graves to delay the formal charging procedures pending further investigation. What Peter proposed, with an air of studied casualness, was that certain aspects of the case warranted additional scrutiny, and that he himself would be delighted to undertake a more exhaustive examination of the available evidence, with the understanding that should his investigations prove fruitless, the arrest would proceed with undiminished vigor. Graves, somewhat reluctantly, had agreed to this arrangement, though not without expressing considerable skepticism regarding the utility of further investigation and the questionable nature of pursuing leads that appeared, to his sensible police mind, entirely extraneous to the matter at hand. Peter's first action subsequent to this understanding had been to obtain from the local physician a more detailed account of the colonel's final hours and the precise manner in which strychnine poisoning manifested itself in the human physiology. Dr. Hammond, a man of considerable medical experience and the sort of professional curiosity that transcended mere clinical observation, had provided a thorough exposition of the toxin's effects, its rate of absorption, the timing of symptomatological manifestation, and the precise quantity required to produce the observed results. Most significantly, Hammond had mentioned, somewhat elliptically, that he had observed certain peculiarities in the colonel's condition at the time of examination, a particular rigidity of the musculature, a specific arrangement of the facial features, and a certain quality to the post-mortem discoloration that suggested the poisoning had occurred somewhat earlier than the conventional assumption regarding the timing of death had proposed. The colonel, Hammond had speculated with medical precision, had likely ingested the strychnine not at approximately 7:30, as had been initially assumed, but rather at some considerably earlier juncture, perhaps during his afternoon tea or immediately preceding the evening meal. This observation, whilst appearing initially to constitute merely a refinement of temporal detail, proved upon further reflection to possess rather significant implications regarding the logistics of the crime and the identity of those who might have had access to the colonel at the relevant juncture. Armed with this information, Peter had undertaken a systematic reconstruction of the colonel's movements during the day in question, interviewing the various servants and household members regarding the precise timing of meals, the colonel's habits, his consumption of refreshment, and the specific arrangements of his daily routine. What emerged from this exhaustive inquiry was a timeline of considerable specificity. The colonel had taken his afternoon tea at approximately 4 o'clock, had subsequently retired to his study, and had remained there undisturbed until the dinner hour at 7. During this interval, only 2 individuals had possessed legitimate access to the study: the valet, who had entered at approximately 5 o'clock to lay out the colonel's evening clothes, and Mrs. Merriweather herself, who had made a brief visit at approximately 5:15, ostensibly to discuss some matter relating to household accounts. Peter had noted with particular interest that upon neither occasion had the door been locked, that both servants had been dismissed without unusual fuss, and that the colonel had appeared, to those who had observed him, to be in his customary temperament. Irritable, certainly, but not unusually agitated. The valet, when pressed upon the matter of his observation regarding the ajar door at 7 o'clock, had admitted upon reflection that he might have been mistaken, that the door might have been open merely for purposes of ventilation, and that he had perhaps misremembered the precise sequence of events. This admission, whilst appearing to constitute merely a minor correction to his previous testimony, had in fact provided Peter with precisely the sort of discrepancy that suggested the architecture of deliberate misdirection. It was during this phase of his investigation that Peter had taken the somewhat theatrical liberty of requesting that the household reassemble itself in the colonel's study for purposes of what he described, with deliberate vagueness, as a procedural reconstruction, a phrase sufficiently ambiguous to suggest official requirement without precisely committing him to any particular course of action. Inspector Graves, sensing an opportunity to either validate his preliminary conclusions or at the very least witness the deflation of Peter's theoretical edifice, had agreed to supervise this arrangement, and by late afternoon on Saturday, the relevant parties had been gathered in the study. Richard Merriweather, still smarting under the indignity of recent arrest, Mrs. Merriweather, maintaining her composure with the meticulous precision of a woman accustomed to performing rather than experiencing emotion, the valet, nervous and increasingly uncertain regarding the reliability of his own recollections, and the various servants who had possessed any contact whatsoever with the colonel during the critical hours. Peter had positioned himself at the study's window, his back to the assembled company, and had commenced a prolonged and apparently aimless discussion regarding the properties of light at various hours of the day, the behavior of plants in relation to available illumination, and the precise specifications of the azalea that had previously graced the colonel's desk. His remarks, whilst individually coherent, had possessed the quality of conversational tangentiality that suggested either professional disorientation or the calculated mystification of an audience not yet prepared to receive the full architecture of one's conclusions. It was at this juncture that Peter had turned to address the assembly with that particular expression of courteous interest which invariably preceded the introduction of some observation that rendered previous certainties considerably more suspect. He had inquired, with the sort of ingenuous tone that concealed considerable calculation, precisely which. member of the household, possessed the greatest familiarity with horticultural procedures, and whether anyone could speak to the specific properties of the azalea that had occupied the corner of the study. The head gardener, Pettigrew, had been summoned for this purpose and had confirmed with evident pride that the azalea had required extensive specialized care, that the watering schedule had been executed with meticulous precision, and that the plant had been in fact considerably more fragile than its appearance might suggest. Peter had then posed the seemingly innocuous question of whether the azalea's soil possessed any particular characteristics, whether it had been treated with any specific substances to enhance its growth or protect it from disease, and whether anyone might have observed any alterations to the plant's condition during the days immediately preceding the colonel's death. Pettigrew had hesitated momentarily before admitting that, indeed, the colonel had personally requested, some 3 weeks prior, that a particular fungicidal preparation be applied to the soil, a substance that Pettigrew had procured from a horticultural supplier in London and had administered precisely according to the colonel's detailed specifications. The substance, Pettigrew had explained, was somewhat volatile and required careful handling, as it possessed certain toxic properties that necessitated protective measures during application. Peter had smiled that particular smile which caused Inspector Graves to experience renewed prickling sensations at the base of his spine, and had proceeded to pose a series of questions regarding the precise timing of this application, the colonel's specific instructions regarding the procedure, and whether the colonel had, at any juncture, expressed concern regarding the toxicity of the preparation or requested any modifications to the SDA. DARD procedure. Pettigrew had confirmed that the colonel had been unusually particular regarding the timing, that he had insisted upon the application being executed on a specific afternoon, and that he had provided rather elaborate instructions regarding the containment of the preparation and the disposal of any contaminated materials. What had emerged from this seemingly peripheral line of inquiry was that the fungicidal preparation in question, a compound based upon a metallic salt, possessed the property of rendering the azalea's soil distinctly unpleasant to the taste, a characteristic which the colonel had apparently intended to exploit as a safeguard against any accidental consumption of the substance by household members who might carelessly ingest portions of the plant. Peter had then requested that the azalea, which had been retained as evidence, though for what precise purpose no one had adequately determined, be examined by Dr. Hammond with particular attention to the composition of its soil and any residual traces of chemical preparation. Hammond, upon undertaking this analysis with considerable chemical precision, had reported that whilst the fungicidal preparation was present in abundance, there existed also within the soil a secondary substance, one not accounted for by Pettigrew's administration, and one that analysis suggested to be a derivative of strychnine, evidently introduced in concentrated form and subsequently distributed throughout the soil medium. This revelation had precipitated a moment of considerable confusion among the assembled company, for it became apparent that the colonel, far from being the poisoner, had himself become the poisoned, though in a manner considerably more elaborate than simple administration through beverage or foodstuff. Peter had then proceeded to elucidate, with that particular combination of precision and theatrica, the flair that characterized his more significant revelations, the precise mechanism by which the crime had been executed. The azalea, he had explained, had been treated not merely with fungicide, but with a strychnine preparation of extraordinary subtlety, one that had been carefully calibrated to dissolve gradually into the soil's moisture and consequently to be absorbed in minute quantities through the act of regular watering, a process that would have poisoned the colonel in slow accumulation over a period of weeks, with symptoms initially attributable to various minor ailments or the inevitable deterioration of advancing age. However, the process had been accelerated, Peter had suggested, through the deliberate introduction of an additional concentrated dose administered directly into the azalea's soil. At some juncture subsequent to Pettigrew's initial application, the question that remained, Peter had observed with studied casualness, was not who had wished the colonel dead, a motivation that appeared to distribute itself rather generously among the assembled company, but rather who possessed the specific knowledge, the technical capability, and the precise access necessary to execute a scheme of such considerable sophistication. This question, Peter had intimated, required investigation into matters considerably more complex than simple financial motive or domestic grievance, matters that touched upon conspiracy, premeditation of an almost ritualistic character, and the involvement of individuals whose presence in the household had escaped the conventional attention of the investigating authorities. The admission regarding the azalea's adulteration had produced a moment of peculiar stasis within the study, a silence pregnant with the recognition that the investigation had shifted fundamentally from the realm of simple domestic crime into something considerably more sinister and architecturally complex. Inspector Graves, his professional confidence visibly shaken, had demanded to know precisely how Peter proposed to identify the individual responsible for introducing the concentrated strychnine into the plant's soil, a question that appeared to anticipate Peter's next revelation with almost prescient accuracy. Peter had responded by requesting that the household servants be temporarily dismissed, a measure that Graves had authorized with some reluctance, and that the remaining company attend to a rather specific line of inquiry regarding the disposition of the azalea during the critical hours preceding the colonel's death. Mrs. Merriweather had been invited to describe, with maximal precision, her visit to the study at 5:15 on the afternoon of the poisoning, and had acknowledged, after some hesitation, that she had indeed made such a visit, ostensibly to discuss household accounts, but in reality to ascertain whether the colonel had yet discovered certain matters of considerable personal delicacy. She had observed, she had admitted, that the azalea had appeared somewhat disheveled, as though someone had recently disturbed its positioning or adjusted its soil. She had thought nothing of this at the time, naturally, having attributed the disturbance to Pettigrew's customary ministrations, but she had subsequently recalled, upon reflection, that such activity would have been unusual at that particular hour, as the gardening staff typically attended to the study's plants during the morning hours, rather than in the late afternoon. Peter had thereupon posed a question regarding the precise location of Miss Crane, the lady's maid whose departure had followed so conveniently upon the colonel's death, and had suggested that Inspector Graves undertake immediate inquiries regarding this individual's whereabouts, her actual ident, Titty, and her potential connections to the scheme of blackmail that had previously ensnared the household. Graves, by this juncture, somewhat reconciled to the notion that his preliminary conclusions had been catastrophically premature, had authorized these inquiries with something approaching genuine interest, and within the space of several hours, Scotland Yard had located Miss Crane, or rather the woman operating under that assumed designation, in a modest residence in Brixton, where she had been discovered engaged in the systematic packing of her belongings with an evident intention of departing the jurisdiction with considerable expedition. She had identified herself, when confronted with the authorities' questions, as Miss Eleanor Hartwick, though Graves' subsequent investigations had revealed this to be merely the most recent of a considerable succession of assumed identities, and that she had indeed operated in conjunction with young Hartley in the elaborate scheme of photographic blackmail that had so thoroughly compromised the colonel's peace of mind. The woman herself had proven remarkably composed when confronted with the evidence of her involvement in the colonel's death, and had, somewhat to Graves' surprise, exhibited no inclination toward denial or the customary protestations of innocence that characterized most individuals apprehended in connection with capital crimes. Miss Hartwick had explained, with the sort of clinical detachment that suggested considerable psychological peculiarity, that the scheme had originated some 6 months previously, when she and Hartley had identified the colonel as a man of sufficient wealth, psychological vulnerability, and social prominence to constitute a suitable subject for their particular form of exploitation. The compromising photographs of Mrs. Merriweather and Hartley had been manufactured with considerable sophistication, and the colonel had paid extensively for their suppression and for the removal of both conspirators from his household. However, what had not been anticipated, Miss Hartwick had explained with evident regret, was the colonel's subsequent alteration of his will, a development that had substantially reduced the anticipated inheritance of Mrs. Merriweather and consequently diminished the financial prospects of those who had been dependent upon her eventual acquisition of the estate. It was at this juncture that an entirely new conspiracy had emerged, one that had involved not merely Miss Hartwick and the departed Hartley, but also Mrs. Merriweather herself, a woman of considerable cunning, who had perceived in the blackmail scheme the opportunity for something considerably more ambitious than mere financial extraction. Mrs. Merriweather had hired Miss Hartwick as a lady's maid with the explicit purpose of administering the poison, had provided her with access to the azalea and the necessary knowledge regarding its cultivation, and had carefully orchestrated circumstances to suggest that young Richard possessed both motive and opportunity for his uncle's removal. The precise mechanism of poisoning had been remarkably elegant. Miss Hartwick had acknowledged with something approaching professional admiration. The concentrated strychnine had been introduced into the azalea's soil during one of Miss Hartwick's regular maintenance routines, disguised as ordinary fertilizer application and executed with sufficient casualness to escape notice by household observers. The poison had been calibrated to dissolve gradually, producing symptoms that would manifest as progressive debilitation rather than acute poisoning, a process that would have appeared consistent with the Colonel's advancing age and his various physical ailments. Mrs. Merriweather had intended, evidently, that the Colonel's death would be attributed to natural causes, thereby allowing her to inherit the estate without the complications that would necessarily attend suspicious circumstances. However, the introduction of the concentrated dose had accelerated the poisoning's timeline considerably beyond what had been anticipated, resulting in the Colonel's death occurring within days rather than the weeks that had been originally envisioned. This miscalculation had been attributable, Miss Hartwick had explained with evident irritation, to Mrs. Merriweather's excessive impatience and her failure to maintain adequate communication regarding the precise timing of the final poisoning phase. The plan had been to arrest young Richard upon suspicion, secure his conviction through the presentation of circumstantial evidence, and thereby allow Mrs. Merriweather to inherit the estate, whilst simultaneously ridding herself of an inconvenient nephew, whose potential claims might complicate her future enjoyment of the property. Miss Hartwick had accepted payment of a considerable sum for her participation in this conspiracy, with the understanding that she would depart the jurisdiction immediately following the Colonel's death and establish herself in some location sufficiently remote to preclude inconvenient questioning regarding her involvement. The confession of Miss Hartwick, whilst substantially clarifying the mechanics of the crime and the involvement of Mrs. Merriweather as the primary architect of the Colonel's demise, nevertheless left unresolved certain questions regarding the precise nature of the conspiracy and the identities of those who had collaborated in its execution. Peter, upon hearing Miss Hartwick's account, had observed with that particular expression of refined skepticism that suggested the narrative, whilst containing substantial elements of verifiable true, nevertheless omitted certain crucial details that would require additional investigation to properly elucidate. He had posed a series of seemingly peripheral questions regarding Miss Hartwick's knowledge of horticultural chemistry, her understanding of strychnine's properties and dissolution rates, and her familiarity with the precise calibrations necessary to achieve the gradual poisoning effect that the conspiracy had apparently envisioned. Miss Hartwick's responses to these inquiries had revealed a sophistication of technical knowledge that appeared considerably to exceed what one might reasonably expect from a woman whose professional credentials suggested employment in domestic service and whose criminal background, whilst certainly disreputable, had previously concerned itself with photographic manipulation rather than toxicological precision. This discrepancy had prompted Peter to request that Inspector Graves undertake additional investigations regarding Miss Hartwick's actual background, her educational attainments, and her potential connections to individuals possessed of scientific expertise or medical knowledge. These investigations had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, revealed that Miss Hartwick possessed a considerably more elaborate professional history than her adopted identities might have suggested. She had, in her actual identity as Eleanor Makepeace, studied chemistry at a provincial university, had subsequently been employed as a laboratory assistant by a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and had left that employment under circumstances that remained somewhat obscure, but which appeared to involve the unauthorized procurement of certain restricted substances. Her departure from legitimate employment had been followed by a period of several years during which she had effectively disappeared from official record subsequently. Emerging under various assumed identities in connection with the blackmail scheme that had introduced her to the Merriweather household, this revelation had suggested to Peter that Miss Hartwick's involvement in the conspiracy had extended considerably beyond mere physical administration of the poison, and that her technical expertise had been instrumental in designing and calibrating a poisoning methodology of considerable sophistication. More significantly, it had suggested that she might have possessed independent knowledge regarding the conspiracy's true objectives and timeline, knowledge that her somewhat too convenient confession might have been deliberately designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Peter had therefore undertaken a rather more probing line of inquiry regarding Miss Hartwick's communications with Mrs. Merriweather during the period preceding the Colonel's death, inquiring whether written correspondence had passed between them, whether meetings had occurred at locations beyond the household, and whether other individuals had been involved in the conspiracy's planning or execution. Under the pressure of these more insistent questions, Miss Hartwick had eventually acknowledged that there had indeed been correspondence, that it had been conducted through a somewhat elaborate system of coded messages transmitted via the personal advertisements columns of certain provincial newspapers, and that another individual had been involved in the conspiracy's technical aspects, an individual whose identity she had been paid an additional sum to protect and whose continued safety she remained, despite her apparent confession, considerably concerned to preserve. This admission had prompted Peter to suggest that Miss Hartwick's cooperation, whilst appreciated, might prove considerably more valuable if it extended to the complete disclosure of all parties involved in the conspiracy, a suggestion that Graves had reinforced through the rather pointed observation that charges of conspiracy to commit murder, when prosecuted with full rigor, could result in sentences considerably more severe than those which might accompany a confession coupled with the identification of co-conspirators. Miss Hartwick had ultimately capitulated to this pressure, though not without expressing considerable reluctance and repeated assertions regarding the necessity of certain precautions to ensure the safety of the individual whose identity she was being compelled to disclose. The individual in question, she had revealed, was none other than young Richard Merriweather himself, a revelation that had produced a moment of considerable shock within the investigative team, and had necessitated an immediate revision of the understanding regarding the conspiracy's structure and motivation. Richard, it transpired, had been considerably more thoroughly involved in the scheme than his superficial role as the intended patsy might have suggested. The financial desperation that had rendered him apparently vulnerable to suspicion of his uncle's murder had in fact been deliberately cultivated through a series of communications from Miss Hartwick, in which she had posed variously as creditors, blackmailers, and financial agents, gradually accumulating the appearance of an impossible financial position from which only his uncle's death could provide escape. The conspiracy had been designed, in fact, to frame Richard through a carefully orchestrated sequence of circumstances that would appear to conclusively establish his guilt, thereby allowing Mrs. Merriweather to inherit the estate whilst simultaneously ridding herself of a nephew whose presence might otherwise have complicated her enjoyment of her new circumstances. Richard's own involvement in the conspiracy had been contingent upon his eventual acquittal, which was to be secured through the emergence of evidence that would exonerate him whilst simultaneously implicating someone entirely outside the household, a development that the conspiracy's architects had been carefully engineering through the placement of false evidence and the cultivation of alternative suspects. However, the scheme had foundered upon the fundamental miscalculation that had already been identified regarding the acceleration of the Colonel's death and the unexpected intervention of Lord Peter Wimsey, an individual whose presence in the investigation had not been anticipated by the conspiracy's architects, and whose capacity for logical deduction had disrupted the carefully orchestrated sequence of revelations that had been designed to achieve the conspiracy's objectives. Richard, when confronted with Miss Hartwick's disclosures regarding his own involvement, had initially protested with considerable vehemence, claiming ignorance regarding the full scope of the conspiracy and insisting that he had believed himself to be the victim of an elaborate blackmail scheme rather than a participant in a murder plot. However, upon further questioning, he had admitted to receiving communications from Miss Hartwick, had acknowledged that he had understood these communications to suggest his uncle's imminent demise, and had been sufficiently complicit in the conspiracy to have failed to alert the authorities to the danger, an omission which, whilst not constituting participation in the actual murder, nevertheless rendered him substantially culpable for conspiracy to commit murder and for failure to prevent a felony. 2. Revelation of Richard's involvement in the conspiracy, whilst seemingly to provide a degree of closure to the investigation, had nevertheless created a peculiar tension within the study, for it became apparent that the conspiracy possessed a layered structure considerably more elaborate than had initially been recognized. Mrs. Merriweather, upon being confronted with the evidence of Richard's complicity and Miss Hartwick's confession regarding their collaboration, had exhibited a response that suggested not shock or dismay, but rather a cold, calculated reassessment of her position in light of the investigation's progression. She had risen from her seat with that particular grace which had characterized her throughout the proceedings, and had made a brief statement to the effect that she had anticipated precisely such an eventuality as this, that she had taken the precaution of ensuring that certain documentary evidence existed which would substantially compromise not merely her own position, but that of all parties implicated in the conspiracy. This statement had prompted Peter to pose the seemingly innocuous inquiry of whether Mrs. Merriweather possessed knowledge of the location of the correspondence that had allegedly passed between herself and Miss Hartwick, and whether she would be amenable to the authorities' inspection of such documents prior to formal charges being initiated. Mrs. Merriweather had responded to this inquiry with a thin smile that suggested she understood precisely the implication embedded within Peter's question, and had acknowledged that she possessed indeed several documents of considerable incriminating character, documents which she had retained as insurance against precisely the sort of betrayal by her co-conspirators that had now occurred. Peter had then undertaken what appeared to constitute a deliberately theatrical departure from the study, announcing that he required a period of solitary contemplation to properly assimilate the various revelations that had emerged from the investigation thus far, and that he would return within the space of 1 hour with certain conclusions regarding the precise culpability of each party and the appropriate disposition of the case. This announcement had produced a palpable relaxation within the study, a sense that the investigation had achieved sufficient clarity to permit its orderly conclusion, though Peter himself had manifested none of the satisfaction that typically accompanied the resolution of a complex case. Instead, he had appeared somewhat abstracted, as though his mind remained occupied with details that had not yet achieved their proper configuration within his understanding of the crime. He had retired to the guest chamber, had requested that tea be brought to him, and had seated himself before the window with an expression of profound concentration that suggested he was engaged in the process of reconstructing some element of the investigation that remained incompletely resolved. After precisely 55 minutes, he had descended the stairs with the announcement that he possessed certain final questions that required clarification prior to the formulation of his conclusions, and had requested that all parties reassemble in the study for purposes of what he described, with characteristic vagueness, as a concluding examination of certain peripheral matters. Upon the reassembly of the household, Peter had posed a series of questions that appeared, upon their surface, entirely extraneous to the matters under investigation. He had inquired regarding the precise construction of the study's door, the location of its lock mechanism, the manner in which it opened and closed, and whether anyone had observed any peculiarities in its operation during the D.A. Immediately preceding the colonel's death, the valet had acknowledged upon reflection that the door had indeed exhibited certain irregularities, that it had occasionally remained ajar, despite apparent attempts at closure, and that he had attributed this to a certain warping of the frame consequent upon the advanced age of the structure. Peter had then requested that the door be examined by a carpenter, and upon inspection it had been discovered that the lock mechanism possessed a peculiar defect, one that, whilst subtle, would have permitted an individual with specific knowledge of the door's characteristics to manipulate it in such a manner as to leave it appearing locked, whilst in fact permitting unobstructed access to the room's interior. This discovery had prompted Peter to pose an entirely different line of inquiry, one directed specifically toward the household's nocturnal arrangements and the question of whether anyone might have possessed opportunity to enter the study during hours when its occupation by the colonel was not anticipated. The valet had acknowledged, upon this further questioning, that he had indeed been somewhat irregular in his final inspection of the study during the evening hours, that there had been occasions upon which he had failed to conduct his customary verification of the room's security prior to his own retirement, and that on the evening preceding the colonel's death he had in fact neglected this procedure entirely, having been distracted by a minor domestic matter that had occupied his attention during the relevant hours. This admission had led Peter to suggest that it was entirely conceivable that someone possessed of knowledge regarding the door's defective lock mechanism might have gained access to the study during the nocturnal hours, might have introduced the concentrated strychnine into the azalea's soil at a moment when the risk of discovery was substantially reduced, and might have subsequently withdrawn without leaving trace of their presence. This possibility had prompted Peter to pose the somewhat cryptic observation that the investigation had perhaps been proceeding upon the assumption that access to the study had been confined to daylight hours and to individuals whose presence within the household was recognized and acknowledged, when in fact the most parsimonious explanation for the evidence might involve an individual whose presence within or near the household had escaped conventional notice entirely. Inspector Graves, by this juncture, somewhat accustomed to Peter's tendency toward elaborate circumlocution prior to the statement of direct conclusions, had demanded to know precisely what Peter was proposing, and had suggested with considerable asperity that if additional parties were implicated in the conspiracy, they should be identified forthwith rather than obscured through the medium of rhetorical questioning and theatrical insinuation. Peter had responded to this demand with a degree of theatrical regret, and had suggested that the matter was substantially more complicated than conventional investigation had recognized, and that the resolution of the case required not merely the identification of those who had conspired to murder the colonel, but also the comprehensive understanding of the motivations that had impelled such individuals toward the commission of this particular crime. He had indicated that there remained certain matters of psychological significance that warranted exploration prior to the formulation of final conclusions, and had requested that the assembled company permit him to undertake one final reconstruction of the events that had culminated in the colonel's death, a reconstruction that would necessarily involve certain dramatic elements designed to illuminate the psychological rather than merely the physical aspects of the crime. Graves, though by now thoroughly exasperated with what appeared to constitute an endless proliferation of mysteries and complexities, had nevertheless acquiesced to this request, and had authorized Peter to proceed with whatever procedures he deemed necessary to achieve the complete illumination of the case's true nature and architecture. Peter's proposed reconstruction had taken the form of a request that the household members recreate, with meticulous precision, their movements and activities during the evening hours preceding the colonel's death, a procedure that had necessitated the temporary darkening of the study and the reintroduction of gaslight at the precise intensity that had prevailed during the original evening. The purpose of this exercise, Peter had explained with patient clarity, was to establish precisely what observations would have been available to any individual positioned at various locations within the room, and what conclusions might reasonably be drawn regarding the sequence of events that had culminated in the colonel's poisoning. The valet had been positioned at the study's threshold, Mrs. Merriweather had been stationed at her customary seat, and various servants had been asked to recreate their customary evening activities. As this reconstruction had proceeded, Peter had moved through the study with the deliberate precision of a choreographer arranging the elements of a complex theatrical production, occasionally directing the repositioning of individuals, adjusting the angle of illumination, and making cryptic observations regarding sightlines, acoustical properties, and the manner in which sound traveled through the study's various architectural features. It was during the course of this reconstruction that Peter had drawn attention to a peculiar character. heuristic of the study's construction, specifically the existence of a narrow servants' passage that connected the study to the kitchen premises, a passage whose entrance had been obscured by the placement of a bookcase and whose existence appeared to have been forgotten by the household's current inhabitants, but which, Peter had suggested, would have been perfectly well known to an individual possessed of intimate knowledge of the house's original architectural design. Inspector Graves had expressed considerable skepticism regarding the relevance of this observation, suggesting that any individual utilizing such a passage would necessarily have left evidence of their passage and would have been observed by the kitchen staff during their evening preparations. Peter had responded to this objection by requesting that the household's cook be interrogated regarding her customary activities during the relevant evening hours, and had posed the specific question of whether she had observed any unusual activity, any peculiar odors, or any disturbance of the kitchen arrangements during the time preceding the Colonel's death. The cook had initially protested her ignorance of any such activity, but upon being pressed with more specific inquiries, had admitted with considerable reluctance that she had indeed observed something unusual, specifically the brief appearance of an individual in the kitchen during the evening hours, an individual whom she had initially mistaken for one of the household servants, but whose appearance had been sufficiently ambiguous to render her uncertain of their identity. She had been reluctant to mention this incident, she had explained, because she had assumed that she had been mistaken regarding what she had observed, and because she had feared that reporting her uncertainty might result in accusations of negligence or inattention to her duties. The individual in question, the cook had acknowledged when pressed for further details, had appeared to be of medium height and indeterminate gender, had been dressed in clothing consistent with household servants' apparel, and had moved through the kitchen with an evident familiarity with its layout and contents that had suggested previous experience within the household service. This revelation had produced a moment of considerable significance within the reconstruction, for it became apparent that the conspiracy possessed an additional dimension that had not previously been recognized by the investigative authorities. Peter had thereupon posed a series of inquiries directed toward establishing the precise identity of all individuals who had been employed within the household during the period preceding the Colonel's death, with particular emphasis upon any servants who had been dismissed or had voluntarily departed subsequent to the administration of the poisoning. The household records, when examined with requisite care, had revealed the existence of a scullery maid named Anne Porteous, who had been employed for a period of 6 months and who had departed from her position precisely 2 days following the Colonel's death, ostensibly to accept a position in a household in Yorkshire. The circumstances of her departure had been unremarkable at the time, having been attributed to the natural mobility of domestic servants and the enhanced opportunities available in the aftermath of the Colonel's death, when household arrangements were necessarily subject to substantial revision. However, when Peter had requested that inquiries be made regarding Miss Porteous's subsequent movements and her actual destination upon departure from Rosebloom Gate, it had been discovered that no such position in Yorkshire existed, that no household of the name she had provided had any record of. Employing an individual of her description, and that she had effectively disappeared from public record subsequent to her departure from the estate, Peter had then posed the hypothesis that Miss Anne Porteous had, in fact, been an individual operating under an assumed identity, and that she had been introduced into the household specifically for the purpose of gaining nocturnal access to the study through the servants' passage and administering the concentrated strychnine to the azalea's soil at a moment when the risk of discovery was substantially minimized. This hypothesis had appeared initially to constitute mere speculation, lacking any substantive evidence beyond the cook's uncertain observations and the peculiar circumstance of the scullery maid's hasty departure. However, Peter had then requested that Inspector Graves undertake inquiries with the domestic placement agencies that had originally supplied the household with its domestic servants, and had discovered that Anne Porteous's credentials had been provided by an agency subsequently revealed to be operated by Miss Hartwick's sister, an individual who maintained business premises in London, and who had, upon investigation, proved to possess a considerably more elaborate criminal history than the official records had initially suggested. This discovery had provided the crucial connecting element that had been missing from the conspiracy's architecture, specifically the identification of an additional co-conspirator whose presence within the household had escaped conventional notice, and whose role had been substantially more active than that of the merely supervisory. The implications of this discovery had been profound, for it had suggested that the conspiracy possessed a degree of premeditation and sophistication, considerably exceeding what the individual conspirators had previously been willing to acknowledge. Mrs. Merriweather, upon being confronted with this evidence regarding the identity and role of the mysterious scullery maid, had undergone a visible transformation, her composed exterior giving way to evident distress and a palpable recognition that her position had become substantially more precarious than she had anticipated. Peter had then posed the final crucial question regarding the precise nature of Mrs. Merriweather's relationship with Anne Porteous prior to the scullery maid's introduction into the household, and whether she possessed any knowledge regarding the individual's true identity or the purposes for which she had been engaged. Mrs. Merriweather's response to this inquiry had been initially evasive, but under the accumulating pressure of evidence and the implications regarding the scope of her own culpability, she had ultimately acknowledged that she had, indeed, been in communication with an individual who had presented herself as possessing the capacity to eliminate the colonel through means sufficiently subtle to escape detection as murder, and that she had engaged this individual's services with the explicit understanding that the poisoning would occur within a specific temporal window and would be conducted in such a manner as to permit the deflection of suspicion toward her nephew. The final confession of Mrs. Merriweather, whilst ostensibly completing the architecture of the conspiracy, had nevertheless introduced certain complications that required further investigation to adequately resolve. Peter had observed with characteristic detachment that the conspiracy's structure suggested the involvement of individuals possessed of motivations considerably more complex than the mere pursuit of financial advantage or domestic revenge, and that the precision with which the crime had been executed pointed towards psychological underpinnings that transcended the conventional categories of criminal motivation. He had therefore posed a series of inquiries directed toward establishing the precise nature of Mrs. Merriweather's communications with the mysterious individual who had engaged to perform the actual poisoning, and had requested that any documentary evidence of such communications be produced for the authorities' examination. Mrs. Merriweather had reluctantly acknowledged that written communications did indeed exist, though she had suggested that their production might require certain assurances regarding the protection of her legal interests and the mitigation of charges consequent upon her cooperation. Inspector Graves, whilst displaying considerable impatience with what appeared to constitute endless negotiations and procedural complications, had nevertheless authorized certain conditional agreements regarding the treatment of Mrs. Merriweather's eventual prosecution in exchange for the complete disclosure of all documentary evidence and the identification of the individual who had orchestrated the poisoning's actual execution. The correspondence that had subsequently been produced had proven to be considerably more illuminating than had been anticipated, revealing a sophisticated pattern of communication conducted through intermediaries and carefully encoded language that suggested the involvement of an individual possessed of considerable experience in the conduct of clandestine operations. More significantly, the correspondence had revealed that the conspiracy had possessed a temporal dimension considerably more extensive than the conventional investigation had recognized. The initial communications regarding the possibility of the colonel's elimination had been initiated not in the weeks immediately preceding the poisoning, but rather more than a year previous, suggesting that the conspiracy had possessed the character of deliberate premeditation rather than spontaneous criminal enterprise. The individual who had engaged in these communications had signed herself variously as the accountant, the gardener's phantom, and, in one particularly cryptic message, the woman who remembers, designations that suggested either a deliberately obfuscatory approach to identity or the psychological peculiarity of an individual inclined toward theatrical self-conception. However, embedded within the correspondence had been certain biographical references and contextual details that Peter had recognized with that particular expression of grim certainty that preceded the articulation of conclusions he clearly regarded as substantially discomforting. He had requested that Inspector Graves undertake inquiries regarding the existence of any individual matching the description suggested by the correspondence's contents, and had provided specific parameters regarding age, physical appearance, and criminal history that Graves had transmitted to Scotland Yard, with a notable absence of confidence regarding the likelihood of successful identification. The response from Scotland Yard had been delivered by telegraph within the space of several hours, and had contained information that appeared to validate Peter's hypothesis with remarkable precision. An individual matching the provided description existed in the criminal records maintained by the authorities, though she had been presumed deceased for a period of nearly 12 years, consequent upon her apparent drowning in the Thames during the course of an attempted escape from police custody. Her name had been Elizabeth Marsh, and she had operated for a considerable period as an independent agent within the London underworld, specializing in the provision of services of an exceptionally violent or morally questionable character to client. Possessed of sufficient financial resources to afford her particular expertise, she had been implicated in several murders of considerable notoriety, though insufficient evidence had been available to secure prosecutions in most instances, and her apparent death had been regarded by the authorities as a convenient resolution to a case that had proven exceptionally difficult to prosecute through conventional legal procedures. However, the telegraph had continued, certain intelligence had subsequently suggested that the apparent drowning had possibly been staged, and that the individual had potentially survived and subsequently relocated to the continent, where she had allegedly continued her criminal activities under various assumed identities. Peter had acknowledged the receipt of this information with a nod of grim recognition, and had suggested to Inspector Graves that the identification of Elizabeth Marsh as the architect of the Colonel's murder constituted the crucial element that rendered the entire conspiracy comprehensible in terms of its psychological rather than merely its legal dimensions. Peter had thereupon undertaken the task of explaining to the assembled company within the study the precise nature of the conspiracy and the psychological mechanisms that had driven each of its participants toward the commission of murder. The conspiracy had possessed, he had suggested, two distinct motivational layers. The superficial layer, the one that had engaged the attention of conventional investigation, had concerned itself with inheritance, financial advantage, and the removal of an inconvenient obstacle to the acquisition of wealth. However, the deeper layer, the one that had truly animated the conspiracy and had driven its participants toward the commission of acts substantially more heinous than simple theft or fraud, had concerned itself with revenge, with systematic destruction of an individual who had inflicted considerable suffering upon those he had touched, and with the satisfaction of psychological debts accumulated over a period of years or decades. The Colonel, Peter had explained, had not been the random victim of opportunistic criminality, but rather the deliberately selected target of a conspiracy motivated by ancient grievance and the desire for retribution. Elizabeth Marsh, Peter had suggested, had been engaged not merely as a hired assassin, but as an individual who possessed personal motivation for the elimination of the Colonel, and whose participation in the conspiracy had been contingent upon the satisfaction of emotional rather than financial needs. The investigation had therefore been pursuing an understanding of the crime that had necessarily been incomplete until the identity and motivations of Elizabeth Marsh had been properly illuminated and integrated into the overall architecture of the conspiracy's structure. The precise nature of Elizabeth Marsh's grievance against the Colonel remained, Peter had acknowledged, substantially unclear from the available documentary evidence, though certain references within the correspondence suggested the existence of a family connection, possibly involving a deceased relative toward whom the Colonel had behaved with cruelty or indifference. What appeared clear, however, was that the conspiracy had represented the culmination of a lengthy process of psychological preparation and the gathering of resources necessary to execute a revenge of elaborate complexity and considerable sophistication. Mrs. Merriweather's involvement in the conspiracy had been contingent upon her possession of motive, specifically her desire to escape from a marriage that had become increasingly intolerable and to acquire the financial independence that would permit her to establish hers. Elf, in circumstances of her own choosing. Richard Merriweather's involvement had been substantially more passive, driven by the manufactured desperation that had been artificially cultivated through the communications orchestrated by Miss Hartwick, and by his apparent belief that his participation in the conspiracy would ultimately result in his exoneration and the acquisition of substantial financial advantage. However, the true animating force behind the conspiracy had been Elizabeth Marsh's ancient grievance and her determination to transform the Colonel from a living embodiment of past injustice into a corpse whose death would restore a degree of psychological equilibrium to a profoundly damaged psychological architecture. This understanding of the conspiracy's true nature had suggested that the investigation's resolution necessarily encompassed not merely the identification of the conspirators, but also the comprehension of the deeply human motivations that had driven them toward the commission of acts that conventional morality regarded as fundamentally abhorrent, yet which possessed, when examined from the perspective of psychological necessity, a terrible and inexorable logic. The authorities' subsequent efforts to locate Elizabeth Marsh had proven considerably more challenging than the initial investigation of the conspiracy's surface elements had suggested, for the woman had demonstrated a capacity for concealment and reinvention that bordered upon the pathological. However, Peter had possessed certain advantages that the conventional investigative apparatus lacked, advantages that derived from his extensive experience with criminal psychology and his somewhat unconventional network of informants and associates scattered throughout the underworld and the legitimate commercial establishments that frequented its periphery. Through these channels he had Yulee established that Elizabeth Marsh had been residing, under the assumed identity of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, in a modest establishment in Hampstead, where she had maintained herself through the provision of services to a carefully selected clientele who possessed both the financial resources and the moral flexibility to engage her particular expertise. It had been to this residence that Peter had directed Inspector Graves and a contingent of police constables on a Tuesday morning, a week subsequent to the confession of Mrs. Merriweather and the revelation of the conspiracy's true architecture. The arrest of Elizabeth Marsh had proceeded with a minimum of resistance, though she had exhibited upon confrontation with the authorities an expression of grim satisfaction rather than despair or panic, as though the culmination of the conspiracy and her own inevitable apprehension constituted merely the final movement of a carefully orchestrated composition that she had long anticipated. During her subsequent interrogation, Elizabeth Marsh had provided a narrative account of her motivations and her relationship with the Colonel that had illuminated the final crucial dimensions of the conspiracy's psychological structure. The Colonel, she had revealed, had been directly responsible for the death of her elder brother some 23 years previously, an event that had occurred during circumstances that the Colonel had subsequently managed to obscure through the application of considerable financial resources and the influence that his family's social standing had afforded him. Her brother had been employed as an under-gardener at a country estate where the Colonel had been visiting as a guest and had apparently become involved in some altercation with the Colonel regarding unspecified matters that had escalated into violence, resulting in her brother's death. The official Count had attributed the death to accident, to a fall from a ladder whilst undertaking routine horticultural work. But Elizabeth Marsh possessed knowledge suggesting that the death had been deliberate, and that the Colonel had subsequently utilized his social connections to suppress any investigation that might have revealed the true circumstances. This revelation had transformed the investigation from what had appeared to constitute a sordid conspiracy motivated by financial advantage and domestic revenge into something considerably more profound, a systematic pursuit of justice across more than 2 decades, undertaken by an individual who had never accepted the official narrative regarding her brother's death, and who had dedicated a substantial portion of her life to the eventual elimination of the man she regarded as her brother's murderer. Peter had observed Elizabeth Marsh's recitation of this narrative with an expression of profound melancholy, a recognition that the conspiracy had represented not merely criminal enterprise, but the tragic culmination of a life spent in pursuit of vengeance against an individual who had long since forgotten the casual act of violence that had initiated this elaborate chain of consequences. He had posed certain inquiries regarding the nature of Elizabeth Marsh's certainty regarding the Colonel's guilt, and had received responses that suggested her knowledge derived not from conclusive evidence, but rather from her brother's final communications and her own lengthy investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. The investigation had never proceeded to formal charges, the authorities having concluded that insufficient evidence existed to establish the Colonel's culpability beyond reasonable doubt. Yet Elizabeth Marsh had regarded this bureaucratic failure as merely the impetus toward the undertaking of extrajudicial juice. Tice. She had approached the conspiracy not as an individual seeking to profit from the Colonel's death, but as someone engaged in the execution of a sentence that she regarded as having been inadequately rendered by the conventional legal apparatus, a distinction that rendered her criminal culpability considerably more morally ambiguous than that of her CO conspirators, though not legally less severe. The subsequent prosecution of the conspirators had proceeded through the formal apparatus of the criminal justice system, with a precision and efficiency that suggested the authorities' recognition of the exceptional circumstances attending the case. Mrs. Merriweather had been charged with conspiracy to commit murder and with complicity in the actual administration of poison, charges that she had contested with minimal vigor and which had ultimately resulted in a conviction and a sentence of life imprisonment. Richard Merriweather had been charged with conspiracy and with failure to prevent a felony, charges that had been substantially mitigated by his cooperation with the authorities and his demonstration of genuine remorse regarding his passive participation in the conspiracy, resulting eventually in a sentence of 7 years imprisonment, a duration that many observers regarded as substantially excessive given the marginal nature of his actual culpability. Miss Eleanor Hartwick had been charged with conspiracy and with the orchestration of the elaborate blackmail scheme that had precipitated the entire chain of events, and had received a sentence of 15 years imprisonment, a duration that reflected both her substantial participation in the conspiracy's execution and her role in the engineering of the circumstances that had rendered Richard vulnerable to manipulation. Elizabeth Marsh herself had been charged with murder, with conspiracy to commit murder, and with a variety of subsidiary offenses, and had ultimately been convicted and sentenced to death, a sentence that she had received with an expression of grim acceptance that suggested she regarded the formal apparatus of her own execution as merely the final component of the elaborate revenge that she had spent more than 2 decades in executing. Peter's departure from Rose Bloom Gate had occurred on a morning of unseasonable warmth, his motor car laden with his modest personal effects, and his mind already transitioning toward other matters that required his attention. He had taken a final opportunity to observe the study in its restored state, the azalea having been removed and the room permitted to resume its ordinary appearance as the repository of the Colonel's accumulated life, and had reflected upon the manner in which places and objects inevitably outlasted the dramas that had unfolded within their confines. Inspector Graves had accompanied him to the threshold of the estate, and had offered certain observations regarding his admiration for Peter's investigative methodology and his recognition that conventional policing procedures would have resulted in the conviction of an innocent man and the escape of the true conspirators into continued obscurity. Peter had received these compliments with characteristic irony, suggesting that the investigation had illuminated nothing beyond the familiar truth that human motivation invariably exceeded the boundaries of conventional criminal categories, and that justice, however formally executed, necessarily remained a compromised and imperfect instrument for the remediation of ancient grievances and accumulated suffering. He had delivered himself of a final observation regarding the nature of revenge and its corrosive effects upon those who pursued it with sustained dedication, and had suggested that the colonel's death had purchased nothing beyond the perpetuation of suffering for those who had engineered his elimination. With these remarks, Peter had departed into the Surrey countryside, leaving behind the chaos of the investigation and the wreckage of human lives disrupted by the collision of ancient grievance and modern criminality, bearing with him only the recognition that the pursuit of truth, however intellectually satisfying, necessarily remained subordinate to the deeper human needs for justice, retribution, and the restoration of psychological equilibrium to those whose lives had been irrevocably damaged by the casual violence and systematic indifference of their fellow creatures.